I can't tell you how many times I've heard from one partner or another when the conversation of sex comes up. Do you experience orgasm? Well, no, I don't. Does your partner know that? I don't know. You talk to the partner. Yeah, no, we're both good. And then there's this hesitancy to even describe that because it's like, well, that would kill them if they knew that I really didn't.
All right.
We're back.
We're back
with some Olipop. What are you drinking today?
Our faithful Olipop. This red concoction is cherry vanilla. It's my first time trying it, and it's really good.
Nice. Mm-hmm. I went with the cream soda.
Cream soda.
Yeah, it has a nostalgic flavor for me because as a kid, I used to go to A&W's when those were like all around back in the day.
So was A&W's like a shop or something? Like
so it's a restaurant. It was like a chain it's still around in certain places, but it's basically like a McDonald's or a Wendy's.
Yeah, I've never been to one.
It's pretty much junk food that just I have a soft spot for. When my family and I were vacationing in upstate New York, which is where I grew up. We went to an A&W several times. It's just so, brought me back.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. So cream soda always.
Yeah, it was cream soda or root beer floats.
Or root beer floats. Okay.
Yeah. But this is a little bit of nostalgia for me.
All right.
Yeah,
cool.
So it's good. And with that also, folks, don't forget that if you would like to join us in our consumption of Olipop, feel free to enter the code SODALOVE by clicking on the link below.
Yeah.
And get 15% off.
Yeah. And try yourself some cherry vanilla, cream soda, whatever takes you back memory lane if it's nostalgia for you as well.
That's right.
Yeah. It's good. It's like a healthier.
Yeah.
Right?
Like
there's typically like 5 grams of sugar in one can.
Yeah.
It's not bad.
It's not terrible.
Yeah. Right.
But we're talking about other things that are vices today. So what are we talking about?
Vices, okay. All right. Well, yeah. So there's this question that I think we've had a few conversations about.
Yeah.
And sometimes it comes into therapy, sometimes it doesn't. Is sex a want or a need? Is sex a want or a need?
Yeah. So I think that's a really common question. We kind of touched on part of this a few episodes back in the conversation around marriage.
Oh yeah. Did we dive into sex that much?
I don't think we dove in that much, but the concept here that I think is really pertinent is we talked about whether someone is desired or wanted.
Yes.
And it was brief.
Yes.
I believe that same rule applies here. Right. So if you say, all right, well, I need this from you right now.
I need sex.
Yeah, I need sex, right? I'm dependent on sex. Or if you say, I want this right now, those are two different things. On a basic premise, I would say sex is a want, right? No one ever died from lack of sex, ever. Despite how anyone may feel
like it.
Yeah, never happened. Never went to the ER with, looks like his heart stopped. Why? Because he didn't have sex.
Yeah.
That never happened.
In high school, we used to say like blue balls.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. There's our explicit marker for the episode.
I know, right there.
There
we go. Just take it off. Might as well.
Take it off.
Might as well.
Yeah, but the reality is that like, yeah, it never happened. At that point, it's a feeling, emotional impulse.
A powerful one, though. Powerful one.
100%.
Powerful impulse.
Not going to deny that the biological mechanism for procreation, right, is extremely strong, right? I would say across the board, it's very pertinent. However, I would say that it is a want, not a need.
Now, I don't know if Freud would agree with you, Dale.
All right.
Our father of psychology. Right? I don't know. He's probably rolling in his grave.
Well, especially if we're calling him daddy. That's a different.
Hey, man. Freud is always like, all academic programs start with Freud. And yeah, he's big in terms of psychological history, right? Mm-hmm. So the reason why I say that is, Freud was big into how sex plays a role in our psychology and biology, right? So the libido is what he referred to as the kind of like the primary drive
Yeah.
for human beings, and that if you suppress that sexual urge, like it did lead to dysfunction and anxiety. So he was like, to the point where he believed that humans were driven by avoidance of pain and seeking out pleasure. So the pleasure principle,
Hmm.
right? So that humans are primarily driven by seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. And so in that same vein, sex is a need in that sense, that if we don't experience pleasure, we as humans do not flourish. And so I believe that mindset has extended into a lot of today's culture when it comes to sex.
That's interesting because I think that it's actually very myopic.
Mm.
Because if we're constituting that, for instance, if we're starting with the notion that we say, all right, all of these things we're seeking pleasure, for example, which that first part I don't disagree with entirely, because I think that by and large human beings do things for the mechanism that it delivers to their brain. Sex is a very powerful neurochemical delivery, right?
Mm.
In essence, right, it's going to affect several different neurochemicals: oxytocin, dopamine, you could argue norepinephrine, right? Several very powerful mechanisms. I would say probably the most relevant of those is actually oxytocin, but we'll get into that probably later.
Okay. Yeah.
However, with that though, that's not the only mechanism of action you could use to experience a dopaminergic euphoria feeling.
Mm.
It's what's also interesting is today I feel like more than any other time that I've ever experienced is you have people identifying as asexual.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
what is that exactly? Does that mean now the rest of their lives are being characterized by dysfunction? I wouldn't say that. I think you'd be reaching really far to suggest that, because they are perhaps sexless or they're not experiencing sex.
Yeah.
They're now because you absolutely have other people that perhaps for whatever reason they can't have sex. Does that mean now that they're doomed to miasma and pain? I don't think that's true, because I would say that largely what constitutes sex is, yes, obviously that intimacy factor, but then also the neurochemical pieces that are involved with that idea.
Mm.
It's not the only mechanism that we could argue that's going to deliver those things. A very powerful one,
Yeah.
but I would say not the only one. So, case in point, right? If someone wants to go out and exercise, if they want to drive fast, if they want to create art, if they want to drink Olipop,
Mm.
arguably, or food, for example, all of those things on some level are going to deliver some type of stimulus to your brain, right?
The pleasure, that's
Yes.
we're talking about.
Yes. Now,
Yeah.
in varying areas and dependent upon how those things are facilitated. So let's just start with that notion. Like, sex isn't the only way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. And, to counter Freud, you have other psychologists who came into the field, right? So like Viktor Frankl, and a lot of his psychology is derived from his unique experiences in the concentration camps of Germany, right? So, he opposed the pleasure principle by saying that humans derive fulfillment and meaning, right, from getting a sense of meaning in the world. That it's not necessarily pleasure, but meaning that provides fulfillment for the human. So, for example, looking at those who were in the camps, he found like two different parties. Like, we're all here in the concentration camps, we're suffering. However, he found that those that despaired were not necessarily those that weren't experiencing pleasure, because all of that, everyone was. No, it's not like they were having fun, drinking ollipops, having sex, and again, not to be trite, but these guys were suffering. But in those moments, he learned that there were two kinds of people. There are the people who still managed to choose the attitude and the response that they would have towards their circumstance and choose to live life in a way that they could still derive meaning from that difficult experience. So again, it's not like many of us will go through that experience, but I think it just goes to show that humans transcend pleasure. We transcend pleasure a lot of the time.
Or they can.
They can. Yeah, we can. We have that ability. And the paradox of pleasure is that oftentimes the more we seek pleasure for pleasure's sake, the less fulfilling it is. The hedonic paradox.
The less it becomes pleasurable and desirable.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that because I was just reading a book called Living Life Backwards, and we'll have to talk about this at another point in time because it's very relevant in terms of what I would say grief especially. But David Gibson was talking about just the notion that the moment that we stop actually really seeing things as gifts and we pursue them for their own purpose is the moment that we really don't understand the value of them. And they become so much less valuable.
Okay.
That's a misquote.
Yeah.
Right. He didn't say, but that was the idea of what he's describing, in that essentially that hedonic principle of what you're saying. And I think it's very relevant to this conversation, actually.
So like pursuing sex for sex's sake.
So yes.
For example.
Right. Or if we would say, okay, just living a life of hedonism. Mm-hmm. Right. Somewhere it's going to break down. Now, circling back, is sex a want or a need? Mm-hmm. I would also argue, though, in terms of, let's say, a marriage, a relationship, there's going to be elements that it provides much more effectively, right, than others. So if you can share sexual intimacy with your spouse, you have a much greater potential to experience intimacy on a very visceral level. I don't know that that's disputed. Mm-hmm. And when I say if you have the ability to experience sexual intimacy, I mean you both experiencing intimacy.
Yeah.
Not one person's getting like a cheeseburger and the other's getting like a 4-course meal.
Right. Both parties are fulfilled.
Exactly.
Yeah. And by intimacy, are you just talking about achieving climax, or are you?
I would say that that's certainly an element to it.
Yeah.
Because I think the other issue that comes into the conversation, especially when I talk to couples about sex, is, okay, one person is able to achieve that well, another is not.
Mm. Yeah.
And they don't know, they may not know.
A lot of times it's the woman.
Yes. Yeah. More often than not.
Yeah.
There's more complexity there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I think because of that, right, that certainly has an element to it. But as I said earlier, I think that two people can have a very high level of intimacy without intercourse per se.
Right. Intimacy is not just a sexual thing.
No. Now, I do believe that sex is meant to be extremely powerful. As such, should be revered in that context, because it is. We talked earlier, or I brought up earlier, about this neurochemical oxytocin, right? So if you think of that word, does anything come to mind when you say oxytocin?
Drugs.
Okay.
was that not what you were thinking?
Not quite what I'm thinking. But so one of the things where it comes up a lot is in nursing mothers.
Oh, okay, right? okay.
Fair.
All right. I see what
not Oxycontin.
Yeah. Yeah, no, oxytocin, it's when mothers are bonding with their kids.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
and totally. That's a very, very powerful impulse. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why...
It's like the bonding hormone.
Exactly.
Right? The connection hormone.
That's exactly what it is, right? One of the chief reasons why as soon as a mother delivers a child, they want them to go skin to skin very soon.
Yeah. Right? And then there's studies done of when kids don't have that skin to skin. Failure to thrive.
Exactly. If you were to take that away completely, there was a massive study reviewing this, and children actually died.
Yeah.
right? So it's definitely an essential, I would argue, an essential component to things, especially as a growing human being. But let's make no mistake, that child isn't having sex with their mother. That's not what's happening here, right? But a neurochemical response is being facilitated that is essential, right? I would say in human beings, as time goes on, there's ways to really effectively get that, and there's ways to get that perhaps aren't going to match that delivery system, but they're going to still be very profound and very effective.
So oxytocin is a need. Experiencing that bonding that creates oxytocin,
I would say,
and sex is one way of achieving that.
Yes, I would suggest yes. For relationships, and this is where I would make this distinction. If you're a single human being, right, you don't need sex, and arguably you don't need oxytocin.
Yeah.
Right. If you are an adult male or female, arguably you don't need oxytocin to survive at this point in your life. It doesn't have to occur for you to be able to live. For a baby, right? Because the baby needs its mother, right? So it needs to be able to bond and experience that. So arguably, I would argue that there's a certain element of that does exist, right? But as grown adults, now that shifts.
Yeah.
This would be my opinion according to Dale, right?
Right.
So, and this is where I would say this shifts slightly. So if we want to have a very connected relationship with our spouse, then I would argue sex becomes a need for the relationship.
Not for the individuals, but for the relationship.
Exactly. Or rather, high levels of intimacy become a need for the relationship. If they were just to do intercourse and call that sex, likely it's doing very little, right? We're not just talking about intercourse. We're talking about being able to achieve connection and intimacy. That's what I would argue.
And so you'd say couples who, for one reason or another, are deprived of sex, there is a risk of the relationship suffering.
Certainly not thriving as much as it could.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah. That makes sense.
I believe that it's extremely important for partners to be able to facilitate a process of intimacy with one another. Because quite literally, there's that age-old therapized definition of intimacy, right? Into me you see.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Which is pretty good. It's like really
it's
good.
really powerful.
Yeah.
I remember the first therapist that I had that even described that. And I was like, oh man, that's good.
Yeah.
Right?
So good. I love it. I love sharing that with clients, and then they're like, no way.
Yeah.
So cool. I'm like, gotcha. Yeah. But yeah, same when I heard it for the first time. I was like, it's good. Yeah, it's that ability to be seen and to be known and to be accepted and to be loved and desired for all that you are. And sex is one of those things where you are vulnerable, both physically, because like you're naked most of the time, you're emotionally vulnerable, and it's that vulnerability allows you both to connect in a really special way. And that's why usually, like at the beginning of the relationship, the best time of a marriage is usually at the beginning. You know, you're probably not having a lot of challenges sexually.
I would disagree.
Okay, tell me why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps this would be my argument is this. I would argue too that obviously I'm going to come from a Judeo-Christian perspective in that the ideal would be that the only partner that you have is your wife or your husband. I'm saying this is the ideal.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not trying to shame others if it's like, oh, well, yeah, we had other partners before. It's like, okay, so be it. But we're just talking about, hey, perfect picture, perfect scenario.
Yeah.
I would say the ideal would be there. And I would also suggest that if that was the case, more than likely, your worst sex is going to be at the beginning.
Okay, that's good, because that might be counterintuitive to a lot of people, because oftentimes the good old days, right, are those early days when it was easy, when sexual chemistry and you just jumped on each other, you just desired each other. There was not the kids or the load and burden of life's responsibility weighing you guys down. It was just easy. But you're saying that sex can get better with time. Rather, that should be like the beginning, not the apex that we try to go back to.
Sure, because I'm into equating sex ideally with intimacy, and I would say that intimacy, again, we've brought this up a lot,
Yeah.
this distinction, but I would say intimacy is a value.
Yes.
Right? And what do we know about values?
What do we know, guys? What have we learned?
They don't stop. Right? You can't achieve them inherently. I can't achieve apex intimacy. Right? So, in essence, you keep pursuing an intimacy. That intimacy can grow profoundly. Thereby, your ability to engage with each other can grow in a very significant way.
And so the sex should also grow.
Can.
The sexual experience. And yeah, because I think we've decoupled sex from intimacy. And that's probably one of the main issues that we're talking about. Like the sex was great, but now it's not.
Now what have I got?
Yeah, what does that mean? Does that mean there's no intimate? Right. What does that mean?
Well, I think you're bringing up this other idea, this other point now of a question that comes into play of, people come in and they ask the question, well, it's just sex, or when can it ever be just sex? And usually this is single people that ask this question, or people that are not trying to get married yet. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, well, we had sex, or well, we hooked up.
Mm-hmm. Casual sex.
Right? I believe that is simply trying to pursue impulse. And it's actually, we are taking away from our proverbial 401k in intimacy. Mm-hmm. If we desire to have lasting and fulfilling relationships.
Right. Like, I definitely agree that sex can be channeled for connection, or it can just be channeled to fulfill an impulse, to fulfill an urge, right? I heard someone say that sometimes we have sex from pressure, right? Like we just feel pressure to fulfill that urge, or we have it from the pleasure of connecting with someone else. And I think that impulse is often self-focused, in the sense that I need to fulfill this need. Like I'm horny, so I need to take care of this, right? Either if it's through self-pleasure or it's through hooking up with someone. And I think there's a lot to be said about some of the things that are driving that too, because if you really look at it, sometimes we're more sexually aroused when we're stressed. For some of us, it's when we're stressed, when we need relief, when we need to feel better after feeling bad in this particular life experience. And so it's like, okay, I need to go hook up. I need to go watch something, go to this website, go to whatever that go-to thing is for you. But really it's not really trying to connect with someone else. It's trying to meet an urge that I have within me. And you're saying, and what we've been talking about is that sex decoupled from intimacy.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I would argue that, and to bring up a good friend of ours, C.S. Lewis, mm-hmm. He writes beautifully this allegory of sorts in terms of looking at this from a different mm-hmm. perspective. And mm-hmm. essentially, this isn't a direct quote here, but he tells a story of, okay, so imagine you were to go in to a theater, and we're talking like an old school theater to where they used to have like curtains drawn, right? Yeah. You go into this theater and you see these people staring at the curtains intently. And as the curtains start to get drawn, you see this silver flask on this table, and people are just staring even more intently now. And the silver flask starts to be lifted, right? And as it's lifted just a little bit, you see certain parts of food exposed. And then these people start to salivate almost. And they're staring at this food so intently. And then it's lifted completely to expose all of these beautiful pieces of food. And you're looking at all these people, and then you're looking at the food up on the stage. What comes to your mind?
That food must be either something I've never seen before, or these people are super weird.
Right?
Yeah.
And his argument is that our association wouldn't be to say typically that, oh, well, food's bad. Our association might be to the question, what is wrong with the appetite of these people? Are they not getting fed?
Got you.
And that's his argument in relationship to how in our society, and I would argue immensely even more today, we have a totally misguided appetite towards sex. Right? It's no longer something that's nurturing our body. It's an immediate sugar that just drops and we crash. Right? Essentially, I would argue that in many ways, the problem is not that we desire valuable things. The problem is that we don't. We make altars of fantasy, ambition, impulse, and lust, and we've become bankrupt in intimacy.
Oof. So basically how we prioritize the thing that we're chasing is off, and it ends up not fulfilling us at the end of the day.
Yes.
Yeah. And you said lust. That's I wanted to talk about that.
Okay.
Because I think that's something that we need to distinguish between the sex that is coupled with intimacy and the sex that's decoupled from intimacy.
Sure.
The word lust is, I think many people have different definitions for it. Like some people think lust is a sexual desire. Like some people did think that. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
What do you call it?
So I would say lust is not really sexual desire. I'd say lust is more so a sexual desire that is channeled towards objectification and not necessarily considering the full dimensions of an individual that maybe you want to connect with, right? So C.S. Lewis again, there's a wonderful quote that I think helps distinguish this. So in his book, The Four Loves, right, he talks about Eros, which is like the romantic love from the Greek language. And he distinguishes it between lust, and like Eros and lust are different. And so he says this: we use a most unfortunate idiom when we say of a lustful man prowling the streets that he wants a woman. Strictly speaking, a woman is just what he does not want. He wants a pleasure for which a woman happens to be the necessary piece of apparatus. How much he cares about the woman as such may be gauged by his attitude to her 5 minutes after fruition. One does not keep the carton after one has smoked the cigarettes. Isn't that crazy?
This guy.
Right.
So
right.
good.
And so that's what lust is. Lust is that it is the objectification of a person or a thing in order to fulfill your desire, your sexual urge, your impulse, right? And so the pornography industry knows this very well, right? Because even like the way they'll title videos, it's like this body part, that fetishes and all these specific objectified things that will appeal to your senses. And it's like, I don't care about the name of the person, their age, their family background. I just want what I want and what I'm here to get. Versus when we're talking about sex with intimacy, you're having sex with someone that you know, that you connect with, that you That's someone who, of course, like consent is another big thing when it comes to sex, right? It's someone who wants you and you want them back. It's very different from lust. Lust, in many ways, seeks to devour instead of honor.
I like that distinction.
Right? It's at the expense. Like, I'll get what I want at the expense of this person, because it's all about the objectification of it. Right? And so, just to finish the quote, he then contrasts it to Eros. And he says, now Eros, which is different from lust, makes a man really want not a woman, but one particular woman.
Mm.
In some mysterious but quite indisputable fashion, the lover desires the beloved herself, not the pleasure she can give. Yeah, chew on that. Yeah, right?
It's fantastic.
Isn't that good?
Yeah, it's so good.
Yeah.
Which I think in many ways, this also speaks, and this would be a separate podcast in many ways, but I think it also speaks to how attraction can be manipulated and malleable. Because
right.
when desire is there for that person, it matters much less what they look like. Right.
Yeah.
What matters is the connection that's there. Now, initially, obviously, there's biological impulses that you're going to notice on, say, first glance, right? But those things, I would say, are heavily altered after connection starts to take place, if we allow that to. And I think, again, there's the question that we kind of brought up earlier.
But can
it ever be just sex?
Yeah, can it
be just that thing? And I would say, sure, it can be, but at what cost?
At what cost?
At what cost?
Yeah.
How much are you willing to let go of in your proverbial intimacy bank account to allow it to be just sex? And this isn't a bank account that, hey, just impacts you. This impacts potentially the rest of your life and your connection with other people, rather the one person that's supposedly the most important.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, it could be, but at what cost?
At what cost? Yeah. And Louise Perry, she's a author, and she wrote the book The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And she basically asserts that, like, while the sexual revolution was coupled with the civil rights movement, helping women have civil rights, she argues that it actually harmed women instead of helped them, and that the idea that women can just go out and have casual sex, similar to how like many guys do, that actually it hurts them more than helps, in the sense that, like, I just can't go and have this super intimate experience and just act like I'm just scratching an itch, right? Like, sex is not the same as scratching an itch. And that's basically our argument, that sex is actually meaningful. And we know that because of consent, right? Somebody scratches you, itches you, somebody like touches you on a train by mistake.
I say, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Right? But somebody tries to sexually, abuse you or manipulate you or utilize you for their sexual fulfillment without your willingness, there's much more meaning to it. Way more meaning to it. So we know inherently that sex is meaningful. We know inherently that sex is sacred, right? So for her, she's like, this is, why are we acting like we don't know this thing is sacred? It's meaningful to us. And so then she argues that casual sex is not as casual as you think it is, in terms of the cost and the impact it has on the psyche. And then she says, like, particularly with women, she focuses on women. But I would say the same. I'd argue the same applies to men.
I would too. I think that, again, I'm going to bring up this statement again, just for the sake of saying it. The problem isn't that we value valuable things. The problem is that we don't.
Yeah.
To her point, we have become bankrupt on intimacy by paying out debts and filling up that credit card with meaningless virtue. virtue towards self and self-fulfillment, which is actually very sad.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And you see, and then I guess in the context of a relationship, you find that when sex is decoupled from intimacy, that's when I think you do find the sexual problems, right? That I'm not
100%.
like, I'm not getting the sex that I want.
100%. Dissatisfaction to a high degree.
Yeah. It's like, because we've decoupled it.
Well, and I think this is the other sad part about that is then people begin to question whether or not it's even relevant or meaningful or can be. Right. And I would say for women, right, if because predominantly the truth is that still a much higher degree of women don't experience intimacy, or excuse me, don't experience orgasm within sex compared to men.
Yeah.
I mean, we've known that for a long time. I would say when that exists in that way, then we have this large issue to where there's a question of, well, is it possible for me to, right? Can I experience intimacy to a high degree with my partner in the same way? Right?
Like, is it possible for me to orgasm, or is it
No,
possible for me to experience
both,
intimacy?
right? So again, I'm combining the
yeah,
notion of,
okay, because we're combining the two.
Exactly. So
Okay.
like when we have these things coupled together, right? And if they're not experienced to that degree, like, so if we're not, like, if we believe, okay, sex and intimacy are tied together and one person is really not experiencing the benefits from that piece, right, then it's a significant problem potentially. So how then can we facilitate that process? And I would suggest that in many ways, you have to start back at square one for people into beginning to understand and beginning to be selfless in how they approach that experience. Because I think in many cases, what happens is, as we talked about earlier, the idea of sex, I would say by design, was for intimacy, into me, you see.
Connection.
For connection. On a pragmatic basis, it feels very uncomfortable for someone to say, I don't like this, I do like that, can you do this, can we do that, right? Because I would say for some people, in terms of talking about their own body or even trying things on for size, it doesn't feel natural. And of course it doesn't feel natural if you've never done that. If you don't know how your body responds to things, then it's not going to feel natural yet, right? So I think there's a lot of areas that become foreign, unfortunately. And then couples have a harder time understanding how to provide satiation to each other and a fully encompassed experience to one another.
Right. Because then what you're talking about too is a level of communication that must take place, and that can be hard. And then the thing you realize is that sex is more than penis meets vagina.
Yes.
It's not just the organs that are interacting.
Sure.
It's like your brains, your minds.
Sure.
There's communication that needs to take place, and that oftentimes when you get into the bedroom, it's like, okay, let's just do it. Let's figure this out. Let's not talk. Let's not communicate. Keep it natural, right?
I can't tell you how many times I've heard from one partner or another, oh, well, do you, like, when the conversation of sex comes up, do you experience orgasm? Well, no, I don't. Well, does your partner know that? I don't know. You talk to the partner. Yeah, no, we're both good. And then there's this hesitancy to even describe that because it's like, well, that would kill them if they knew that I really didn't.
And why is that? Why would it kill them? Because that's another thing too, is that to provide feedback when it comes to the sexual experience, especially to your partner, it feels super sensitive.
I think inherently you often see this more with men who identify with this idea to be a extreme expert in the bedroom and an expert at sex, to where, okay, you can make any woman orgasm or something. It becomes a conquest piece, and to the point that like if you can fulfill your partner's desires in this way, that means you are masculine or a man.
Right. Yeah, tying back to your episode,
tying back to the previous episode on
performance related.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It becomes heavily performance related, and to a degree, it's understood why that would be. Mm-hmm. However, at the end of the day, it's interesting to think about too, because you think about all of these individuals say, and again, like if you were to go on a college campus, like guys can rack up the number of partners that they have. Does that mean they're actually good at sex? No, it does not.
Yeah.
All it means is they do a certain function, because quite literally, for them to be good at sex is actually way more subjective, because we're talking about a highly individualized experience.
Yeah, like what pleasures one woman is not, in that case would not pleasure this woman.
Exactly. Yeah. So quite literally, in order for someone to experience the highest level of gratification from another, I would argue that there has to be a level of intimacy there. Mm-hmm. There has to be known between the two, if we're talking about the highest level. And I would argue that's a value to constantly pursue. So therefore, the only thing that it makes you, if you have a high number of partners, is promiscuous.
Yeah.
Right. And you get a higher probability of getting STDs. Good job.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but then the unfortunate thing is that when you do get into a partnership, you then think that in order to maintain desirability from my partner, I need to fulfill them sexually and I need to perform. But I'm not going to ask for that feedback. I'm not going to check to see if they're fulfilled. I'm just going to hope that they're responding in the way that they need to respond, and we're not having this conversation. And so like I've heard it too, like from friends, from clients. It's like the woman's not willing to provide feedback, and even if it's just like, my husband wants sex from me, I'm not gonna say no. I'm gonna say something like, I'm tired. Oh, I have a headache. I'm tired. You know, like one time my friend, she was like, "Oh, you've never heard about the headache? Like, this is what we all say as women. Like, you say you have a headache. You don't tell your man you don't want sex with him. You just tell him you have a headache."
That's so funny.
I'm like, why is that? Why do we have to lie? Why do we have to not just say like, hey, it's not I don't want you. It's just I don't want sex today.
I think a lot of that is also becomes tied in, because I think if one individual doesn't know how to facilitate that process for themselves, or if they get the idea that, oh, well, maybe I just can't experience gratification from this, I would say typically the trend is they just get discouraged. And so then they think it's not possible. So then therefore it becomes way less desirable inherently, so in essence, then it's not pursued at all.
Right.
And so then why would, but if they're aware that, well, they can't say that, so now it's a setup for a scenario to where, or an argument to where I don't actually like this. I don't know why. And so I would argue that one of the most beneficial things to do, and this is on both sides of the street, but for both individuals to be able to start back at square one. The whole idea, and again, this is coming from like a Judeo-Christian perspective, right? If we look at this philosophically, in the Bible, to talk about having sex with someone means that you know them, right? How often does it use?
Yeah.
They went together, and he went to her, and they knew each other.
Yeah. Right. AKA they had sex.
Yeah, AKA they had sex. Right. But why would it use that word?
They knew each other.
Yes. Right. I would argue that it uses that word because you're talking about being able to experience one of the most profound, fundamental human experiences that you can, that also facilitates life and living. But the life and unity between the two people, it's extremely profound.
Yeah.
So starting back at basics then to say, all right, how can I know you? I would also argue too that this would be a reason to try to do that through a process that's organic and between two people rather than facilitating it with other objects, right? I'm talking about sex toys.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think inherently, again, this is slightly off topic, but I would say that there's value in, unless there's significant challenges, and again, that's between you and your spouse.
Yeah, and also with the more elderly you are, sometimes
exactly
struggle,
right. Yes,
the body does not function the way it used to.
Exactly, but I would argue like if that's being incorporated because you don't know how to help your partner help you, that's an area for growth. And if we view intimacy as a value that we pursue, that's an area for growth.
It's a blocker. Is this a blocker to further intimacy between the two of us?
That's the question I believe that should be asked. Is it preventing me from being able to know my partner in a way that could facilitate a much more fulfilled experience?
Which might take more communication, might take more effort, more patience.
And if we don't want to communicate, then why is that?
What's the hesitation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If we don't want to be patient with this, then why is that?
Yeah.
What is at the root of that scenario? Because I think those are all very important questions, right? I've known other couples to where it's like, well, they really don't want to have sex unless they've drank a little bit because inhibitions, right? Or it's like, oh, I can have my best sex if I'm drunk. It's like, wait a second.
Why is that?
Have you ever thought to ask the question as to why? Because that's a very slippery slope if we're constituting it in that way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of pieces there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, and you even talk about like the pull for people to seek out like fee or prostitutes. It's like, because with that I can compartmentalize sex from commitment, from the need to communicate, from the need for responsibility, from the need to know, right? At the end of the day,
I think it's also, there's an element to it, especially with the idea of having sex with other people at their expense. If we believe that, because I think it goes in part and parcel into two ways, because there's the notion that, okay, I'm going to use this person at my expense, but then I think people often want the idea that someone will want them and they're willing to pay for that.
Yes.
So they're willing.
Like, that's why we have like OnlyFans.
Exactly.
Because now you're able to even like pay for someone to send you a personalized message, even though they're acting, they don't know you, right? But it's like that pseudo intimacy, right? Because we're still chasing intimacy, really. That's what we are chasing intimacy, but in these pseudo forms that are not the real thing.
We're masters of our own self-deceit.
Yeah.
Even so, insofar as we're willing to pay for it.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's a relevant question then to ask, okay, at what point do I want intimacy security? Right? Because if we're talking about this as if it were a financial perspective, we're beyond bankrupt, like as we used in the example earlier. At what point is honesty even relevant for me to accept that none of these people actually desire me? It's a farce. It's a show.
Fantasy.
It's a fantasy. We talked about this idea that Lewis was advocating, right, for fantasy, because fantasy can be a very powerful tool.
Yeah.
Right. And we talked about how, and it was some episodes back, I don't even remember what we were talking about, but just that idea though, that you can utilize that for a tool of function or a tool of destruction, because there's bad fantasy.
Yes.
Or rather highly unhelpful fantasy. And I would argue that is one of the chief among them.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Big one.
That's made billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah. Right. And then, for many men, it's visual. And then for women, it's usually an erotica sexual novels.
Yes.
That's that fantasy.
And
That's a whole other.
This was an
rabbit
interesting.
hole. Yeah.
Well, and that brings up a good point though, because I think this is where we could. Then other people will make the argument, well, if I don't know how to have intimacy with my partner, isn't it okay for me just to engage in fantasy in this way?
Not as a tool, but just as an alternative?
Yes.
Like, just as an alternative.
What's wrong with that?
If I'm not experiencing intimacy with my partner.
Yes.
Well, clearly we're having issues here with the partnership then.
Right.
Let's not avoid that.
Right. And so but that's common.
It's very common. And I empathize with it. I empathize with it because that must be hard. That must be a hard place to get to a point where it's like, you know what? Screw this. Trying with my partner to connect and to have intimacy. This is gonna be my alternative. Whether it's the novel, whether it's pornography, whether it's the OnlyFans, like, this is how I'm gonna fulfill my needs sexually and try to experience some sort of intimacy, because I just can't experience it with a person whom I've chosen to be with, the person whom I share a life with, the person who I share kids with. That's sad, and that must hurt a lot for you to be in that place. However, this is not the best alternative, and we know that this is not the best alternative. This is not the ideal.
It's not helping you.
It's not helping you.
It's actually going to hurt you more than it is going to help you.
Mm.
I would argue that one of the saddest things about, we could say that, and even pornography usage for men, which is more common, right? Yeah. It's not that they're, I believe that the saddest part about the usage of pornography in an attempts to satisfy is not the action itself, but the fact that you're deceiving yourself. You are lying.
Say more there. What do you mean?
So in essence, we've already talked about this notion that, okay, I am believing that this person longs for me, and I know that it's false.
Okay.
I am believing that somehow I am providing satisfaction or gratification in some way, and it is a lie. And I'm willing to engage with it momentarily, even though bit by bit, in order for me to engage with that, I'm decoupling and fracturing my own conscience, because I'm ignoring the notion then to be intimate or have intimacy moments with my partner.
Yeah.
I'm not only ignoring that, but now I'm also believing this all the other alternative lie that this person longs for me in some way, that they desire to be in this process with me, which is completely false. That is the saddest part. I would say that if we're talking from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that part is the sin. And arguably in the Bible, it talks about, okay, like, worse for a man to, butchered that. Man sins against his own body.
Right.
And I would say that is a example of that.
That's an example.
But again, hey, take away pornography for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Erotica novels.
Yes.
All of a sudden now we're using a very powerful tool of fantasy to be engrossed in this moment, to believe that we are there, because we can't take the reality of where we are currently.
Right. Let's escape to another.
And I would say that the saddest part about that is that we are believing the lie that we can't truly have the intimacy that we would desire with our partner, that the cost is too high, the burden is too great.
Yeah, we're settling.
We are settling for less. That is the saddest part.
Yeah.
Not even about, hey, okay, my partner doesn't know I'm reading erotic novels. It's like, okay, whatever. But the saddest part is that we're settling.
Yeah. Right. It's the impact of that on your psyche and your soul. Of settling for less. Man. Well, you got something?
No.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. Well, another C.S. Lewis quote, and he writes a letter to a friend.
Walter Greaves?
Keith Mason.
Keith Mason.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, was Walter Greaves
so
a lot of letters?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Go for it.
Go
for it,
well, Dale's definitely dive deep more into C.S. Lewis than I have. Like, I don't know who Walter Greaves is, but yeah. So here he's talking about the evil of self-pleasure.
Okay.
What's wrong with self-pleasure? What's wrong with, and in that bucket you can put it in, you can put the erotica,
anything in there,
the porn,
food,
right,
Olipop,
right. But he's talking about it in the sexual sense.
Sure.
So he basically says that ideally, sex should lead the individual out of himself
and to the other,
to complete his own personality in that of another, and finally in children and even grandchildren. And so instead, what happens is it sends the man back into the prison of himself, there to keep a harem of imaginary brides. And this harem, once admitted, works against his ever getting out and really uniting with a real woman. Right? So, because it's really disconnecting you further from reality. And so he says, for the harem, and some people might know what that word means.
Harem.
Harem. Yeah. Oh, harem.
Yeah.
Harem.
You can say harem. I like the accent. That's
harem.
good. Yeah.
Kenny, I'm Kenny.
Yeah, we'll go with it.
Yeah. So the harem, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Okay. For the harem is always accessible, always subservient, calls for no sacrifice or adjustments, and can be endowed with erotic and psychological attractions, which no woman can rival. Among those shadowy brides, he is always adored, always the perfect lover. No demand is made upon his unselfishness, no mortification ever imposed on his vanity. In the end, they become merely the medium through which he is increasingly adores himself. After all, almost the main work of life is to come out of ourselves, out of the little dark prison we are all born in. And so that's why he says this is to be avoided, because at the end of the day, it takes us back into ourselves. It disconnects us from what reality demands, which is to be unselfish, is to sacrifice, is to reach out to others. So they'll all ideally reach out to you too, and so you guys can actually connect.
That is such a powerful quote. Such a powerful script, I think. I think it also acknowledges the reality too that when intimacy is shared between two people, whether it's in a sexual manner or like vicarious sexual manner, that is so much greater, and the level of satisfaction achieved is surreal at times. I think the unfortunate part is that when people believe that lie, they also believe the other lie that tells them that I could never achieve anything better than this. When in reality, right, it's like Lewis also uses that idea to say, like, if I don't know what water is, why would I be excited about going to the ocean?
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like we don't even know really what true intimacy is if we haven't experienced it in this real way, and how powerful it can be and how enriching it can be to the process of an experience with another individual.
Yeah.
So then we capitulate and allow ourselves to say, well, this clearly is the best I could achieve.
This is the best that's out there for me.
Right.
Yeah. Right. It goes back to the settling. Right?
Settling.
Yeah. Comes at a cost, though. True intimacy does come at a cost. And that's the cost that people struggle to pay for. But I think what we've shared here is that there's also a cost without it.
100%. So circling back to maybe the original question, is sex a want or a need?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
It's
what do we?
So I think in synopsis we say, okay, or at least my opinion here is that, okay, it is a want,
powerful want,
a very powerful want. It is a need for a relationship to experience elements of intimacy. Now, granted, very powerful neurochemical dimensions going on there, but that's not perhaps the only mechanistic way to achieve those, but it's highly effective.
Yeah, for sure.
So lots of points to consider.
Yeah.
Lots of things to say.
Lots of things to say.
But I think we hit it.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we might talk about it at some point.
Until next time with another, I guess.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers. Enjoy the Olipop.